I watched from the back porch as my grandparents fished at the lake behind their house. Grandpa was all focus, casting his line, eyes glued to his rod, waiting for the telltale tug of a fish. But Grandma? She wasn't watching her line at all. Instead, her gaze was locked on the far side of the lake, head slightly tilted, as if she was listening for something I couldn't hear. She never even glanced at the bobbers dancing on the water. I figured maybe she just liked staring at the trees. Still, there was something unsettling about the way she looked, like there was more to it than just admiring nature. That summer, I was spending my break at their place in Knoxville, Tennessee. They had a cozy two-story house built in 2018, with a dock that stretched out into the lake. Grandpa's bass boat sat tied up at the end, ready for an early morning trip whenever the mood struck. My grandparents lived a quiet, peaceful life, the kind you'd expect from a couple content with their little corner of the world. Every summer, I'd pack up and head over there, a tradition I never missed. Grandma's invitations were impossible to turn down, her warm smile and soft voice felt like home. There were so many things I loved about Grandma, but her stories were the best. She had a way of turning even the simplest tale into an adventure, her words painting pictures so vivid, it felt like I was living them. While Grandpa mostly stuck to his military stories, full of danger and heroism, Grandma's repertoire was endless. She could tell you about mischievous kids from her childhood one day, then spin a fantastical yarn about magical lands the next. Grandpa, though, was quieter. He was the strong, silent type, with a quiet confidence that seemed to anchor the family. His stories, while fewer, carried a weight all their own. Tales of far-off places and challenges faced in his military days fascinated me in a different way. And when it came to the outdoors, Grandpa was practically a legend. He'd learned everything from his military training, always joking that the army had turned him into a survivalist. I'll never forget those early morning fishing trips on his boat, the hum of the motor, and the lake stretching out endlessly in the dawn light. But the nights? The nights were for Grandma's stories. Every evening, I'd climb into bed, snuggling under the patchwork quilt in the guest room. Like clockwork, the door would creak open, and Grandma would walk in, her smile warm and inviting. She'd sit in the rocking chair by the window, and her voice would carry me to places far beyond that little house. Her scary stories, though. They were rare, and unforgettable. One night, I mustered up the courage to ask for one. "Grandma, can you tell me a scary story tonight?" Her eyebrows lifted, just slightly, as if she hadn't expected the request. For a moment, she was quiet, her gaze drifting to the window, where the dark outline of the woods loomed beyond the lake. Then she turned back to me, her expression softer now, like she was deciding whether to say something she'd kept buried. "All right," she said at last, sitting beside me on the bed. Her voice dropped lower, and a strange tension settled in the room. "But this one's different." I felt a chill crawl up my back as she started. "See those woods out there?" she asked, gesturing towards the window. I nodded, my stomach tightening as I looked at the shadowy treetops swaying in the faint breeze. "There's something in those woods," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. My heart thudded in my chest. Grandma's scary stories were always make-believe, just harmless tales meant to thrill. But this time, her tone was different, serious, even ominous. Suddenly, the room didn't feel so warm anymore. Every instinct told me to ask her to stop, to turn back to her usual light-hearted stories. But I couldn't look away. I was hooked. Grandma leaned in closer, her eyes locked on mine. "And it's been watching us." Grandma's voice dipped lower, her words dragging the room into a kind of heavy, unsettling quiet. "Every 7 years, it comes out of those woods," she said, her gaze distant, as if she could see it even now. "It's ancient, older than any of us, and it crawls on all fours, like some twisted predator from a nightmare. It hunts silently, patiently, always searching for its next victim." The room felt colder somehow, and I sat up a little straighter under the quilt, my chest tightening. "It looks like a man," she murmured, "but, wrong. Its body is contorted, limbs stretched too long, like someone pulled them out of their sockets. And its skin, black as coal, makes it nearly invisible in the dark." I swallowed hard, trying to focus on her words and not the shadows outside the window. Suddenly, the woods didn't feel as far away as they had before. "And then there are its eyes," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves scraping across the floor. "So many eyes, scattered all over its face like a spider's. They glow faintly, piercing through the dark, searching for anyone who doesn't belong." Her words clawed at my imagination, filling it with images I didn't want to see. I couldn't help but glance at the window again, expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back. "And if it can't find food in the woods," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper now, "it gets desperate. It moves closer to houses, sniffing around, looking for open windows or doors left unlocked." The image sent a shiver racing down my spine. I tightened my grip on the blanket, my knuckles pale against the fabric. "If it gets inside," she said, leaning in as if to shield the words from the dark outside, "it doesn't kill right away. No, it drags you back to the woods, where it keeps you alive, barely, for 7 years, feeding off you until it's ready to hunt again." The air felt like it had been sucked out of the room. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything but the sound of her voice. "But we're safe," she said finally, her tone softening as she placed a hand on mine. "As long as we keep the windows locked, it won't get in. And when you're back home with your mom, remember to do the same. Always." She stood, her movements deliberate and slow, and made her way to the window. I watched her carefully check the latch, her silhouette framed by the eerie glow of the moonlight. "Grandma," I blurted out, unable to stop myself. "Have you ever seen it?" She paused, her hand resting on the window frame. For a long moment, she didn't say anything, and when she finally turned back to me, her smile was kind but distant. She didn't answer. Instead, she leaned down and kissed my forehead, her lips cool against my skin. "Good night, sweetheart," she said softly. Then she left, the door clicking shut behind her. I stared at the window for what felt like hours, the dark shapes of the woods pressing against the glass. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting. My imagination conjured glowing eyes and twisted limbs, and no matter how tightly I pulled the quilt around me, I couldn't seem to get warm. That night, sleep came in fits and starts, but when it did, the dreams were relentless. I was running, the damp grass slippery under my bare feet. Behind me, something moved, its grotesque form shifting and lunging through the darkness. Its arms stretched impossibly long, wrapping around my legs and pulling me to the ground. The world tilted as it dragged me backwards, the woods looming closer with every heartbeat. The stench of rot and wet earth filled my lungs, and just as the darkness swallowed me whole, I woke up gasping for air. Sunlight streamed through the window, painting the room in familiar, comforting shapes. I took a deep breath, the sound of birds chirping outside slowly grounding me in reality. It had been a dream, a horrible, vivid dream, but the fear lingered, like a shadow that refused to leave. Over the years, Grandma told me many more stories, but the one about the creature in the woods never really left me. It haunted the corners of my mind, resurfacing every now and then when the night stretched too long, or the woods grew too quiet. Then came the summer when everything changed. Cancer crept into our lives, stealing Grandma from us piece by piece. She fought hard, but in the end, it wasn't a battle she could win. Losing her left an ache in our family that never truly healed, and Grandpa, stoic and strong as he always seemed, was hit the hardest. Now, he lives alone in that house by the lake. The rooms that once echoed with Grandma's laughter feel unbearably silent, and his once bright eyes carry a shadow of sorrow. When he talks about her, his voice breaks, and sometimes he says he's just waiting for his turn to join her. It's hard to visit the house now. The dock, the lake, even the woods, it all feels heavier without her there. Yet, every time I look out at the trees, I can't help but remember that story. And every time I visit, I make sure the windows are locked. The silence that followed was more horrifying than any scream. My mother's wide, disbelieving eyes locked with mine for an agonizing moment. Her mouth opened, perhaps to scream or to plead, but no sound escaped. The shadowy limb retracted with horrifying speed, dragging her into the darkness beyond the door. I froze, paralyzed by fear, the splintered bat trembling in my hands. The front door slammed shut with a deafening finality, plunging the room into an oppressive silence. It took a moment before I moved, before I could even breathe. My chest heaved, and my knees buckled, but something deep inside me, some primal instinct to survive, forced me forward. "Mom!" I screamed, my voice raw and desperate as I stumbled toward the door. My hand gripped the doorknob, but the second my fingers touched the cold metal, the lights in the house went out. Darkness enveloped everything, thick and suffocating. My breath came in shallow gasps, the bat clutched so tightly in my hand that I could feel the splinters digging into my skin. Then I heard it. A faint, wet scraping sound echoed from beyond the door. It was as if something massive was being dragged along the porch, its weight grinding against the wooden boards. And then it began tapping. A sharp, deliberate tap against the front door, mimicking the sound that had started it all. The rhythm was maddening, each knock reverberating through my skull. "Mom," I whispered again, though my voice was barely audible over the thundering of my heart. The tapping stopped. For a moment, I dared to hope. But then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of something clawing at the walls of the house, its spidery limbs scraping against the siding as it moved. It was circling the house, searching. My eyes darted to the windows, where faint moonlight filtered through the curtains. Shadows danced along the glass, too large and too alien to be human. I backed away, my legs trembling as I stumbled toward the kitchen. "Think," I muttered under my breath, trying to keep the panic from swallowing me whole. "You need to think." I grabbed the biggest knife I could find from the drawer, its cold weight somehow less reassuring than the bat. But even as I tried to gather my courage, the scraping stopped. The silence was worse. Every second stretched into eternity as I strained to hear any sound, any clue as to where it was. The house was so quiet that I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. Then, from upstairs, I heard the creak of a floorboard. My heart plummeted. It was inside. I inched toward the stairs, every instinct screaming at me to run, to flee into the night. But my mother's face flashed in my mind, her terrified expression as the creature took her. I couldn't leave her, not like this. Each step up the staircase felt like a lifetime, the wooden boards groaning under my weight. The hallway at the top was pitch black, the shadows thick and impenetrable. "Mom," I whispered, my voice barely audible. A low, guttural clicking sound answered me, coming from my bedroom. I gripped the knife tighter and edged closer to the door, my pulse hammering against my ribs. The door was ajar, and through the crack, I could see nothing but darkness. Slowly, I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly in the oppressive silence. The room was empty. Or so it seemed. Shadows clung to the corners like living things, and for a moment, I thought I was alone. But then I saw it, movement near the ceiling. The creature clung to the wall above the bed, its spindly limbs splayed out like a grotesque spider. Its head twisted slowly toward me, its countless eyes glinting in the faint moonlight that filtered through the broken window. In its claws, it held something. A scream rose in my throat as I realized what it was. My mother's lifeless body dangled from its grip, her head lolling at an unnatural angle. Blood dripped onto the floor in a slow, steady rhythm, pooling at the creature's feet. The knife slipped from my trembling fingers, clattering loudly onto the floor. The creature reacted instantly. It dropped from the wall with a sickening thud, landing in a crouch that made its elongated limbs fold in on themselves like a nightmare origami. Its head tilted, its many eyes locking onto mine with a predatory focus. I stumbled backward, tripping over the fallen knife and landing hard on the floor. The creature advanced, its movements fluid and unnaturally fast. In desperation, I grabbed the knife again, brandishing it in front of me. "Stay back!" I screamed, though my voice cracked with terror. The creature paused, its head tilting as if considering my threat. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, it lunged. I swung wildly, the blade slicing through the air, and for a brief, horrifying moment, I felt it connect. The creature let out a sound, a deep, guttural noise that was half screech, half growl. But it wasn't enough. Its claws wrapped around my arm, the strength of its grip nearly crushing the bone. I screamed as it dragged me closer, its countless eyes boring into mine. As the darkness closed in, I thought of Grandma's story, of her warning to keep the windows locked. And then, just before the world went black, I realized the terrible truth. Grandma had seen it. She had always known. And now, so did I. When I woke, I wasn't in my house. The air was damp and cold, carrying the earthy stench of rot and decay. My head pounded, and my body ached, but when I tried to move, I found I couldn't. My arms were bound, suspended above me by something coarse and unyielding. Opening my eyes was a struggle, but when I did, I wished I hadn't. I was in the woods. The dense canopy of trees overhead blotted out most of the moonlight, leaving the surroundings shrouded in darkness. My feet barely grazed the ground, and my arms burned from the weight of my body pulling against the restraints. All around me, I could hear faint noises, skittering sounds, like something crawling just out of sight. And then I saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. Scattered across the darkness, blinking in and out of sight, all trained on me. My breath hitched, panic surging through me as I thrashed against my bindings. The skittering grew louder, and from the shadows, the creature emerged. Its grotesque form was even more horrifying in the faint light of the moon. The way its limbs bent and twisted seemed designed to mock human anatomy, and its head, covered in those terrible, glinting eyes, turned to regard me. But this time, it wasn't alone. More shapes emerged from the shadows, each as twisted and horrific as the first. They moved with the same unnatural silence, their collective eyes glinting like stars in the night. I wanted to scream, but my voice had abandoned me. The creature that had taken me, the one that had killed my mother, stepped forward. Its movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic. From somewhere in its many limbs, it produced something. A piece of fabric. It took me a moment to recognize it, but when I did, my blood ran cold. It was my grandmother's quilt. The realization hit me like a thunderbolt. She had known. She hadn't just seen it, she had survived it. Somehow, she had escaped this nightmare, and the quilt, the stories, they weren't warnings. They were her way of coping. Her way of preparing me for what might come. And now, it was my turn. The creature draped the quilt over me, its clawed hands oddly gentle, as if performing a sacred rite. Then, it stepped back, its many eyes flickering in unison. The others began to close in, their limbs stretching and reaching toward me. My mind raced, desperate for a way out, but the realization came too late. This wasn't just about survival. This was a continuation. As the creatures surrounded me, their movements slow and deliberate, I understood what Grandma had been trying to tell me all those years ago. The 7 years, the stories, the locking of windows, it was never about stopping the creature. It was about passing it on. The creatures began to hum, a low, guttural sound that resonated deep in my chest. It grew louder and louder until it was deafening, drowning out every coherent thought. The quilt tightened around me, the fabric feeling like it was fusing with my skin. Pain erupted in my body, white-hot and all-consuming. My vision blurred, and the world spun, the cacophony of sound and sensation overwhelming every fiber of my being. And then, silence. I opened my eyes. The creatures were gone. The woods were still and quiet, bathed in the faint glow of the rising sun. But something was wrong. I stumbled to my feet, my body moving in ways that felt unfamiliar and alien. My limbs felt too long, my joints bending at impossible angles. Panic rose as I caught my reflection in a pool of water nearby. The face staring back at me was no longer my own. It was their face. Eyes, too many eyes, blinked back at me, scattered across a head that no longer resembled anything human. My body, once familiar, was now a twisted amalgamation of limbs and shadows. The hunger hit me then, a deep, insatiable gnawing in my core. I looked toward the distant outline of the town, the place I had once called home. The cycle would begin again. As I turned toward the trees, my movements now silent and fluid, a thought lingered in the back of my mind. The windows. I would wait for someone to forget. And then, I would hunt.